Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Thunderstock Show. It's a collection of ad brainstorms to enhance your life, liberty, and pursuit of property. This season is all about living the EOS life, the journey of EOS, focusing on those who have been in chaos and now have some clarity. But hey, Rich, thanks for joining. Out of, some would say South Jersey, some would say North. We're going to
Thanks,
call
Ross.
it Central Jersey.
So this Friday, what's
Rich,
getting me fired up?
how
I
you
actually
doing
just
today?
got back
What's
from
getting
a
you fired up for this
conference in
Friday?
Atlantic City where I did a couple of breakout sessions. One was actually on EOS, and another one was, I would call it more motivational, that was really about the topic of what does it mean to fully show up. And so got good response to both. I like them both for different reasons. And so I'm feeling good after having that opportunity.
That is awesome. It also fits with the theme of EOS being a system to optimize for human energy, right? You can't be optimized if you're not motivated.
Wow, great question.
What are some of the ways that
this
help
came up in the
leaders and
talk I did
entrepreneurs, business people
actually 2
stay
days
motivated?
ago when I was down there. And we talked about this notion of when we work with clients to kind of set the long-term vision, and we get into the conversation around core values. And I talked to clients about, we don't want to enter that conversation frivolously, because this is all about setting some behavior standards that you want to see go on in your company so that you attract the right people and are not attractive to the wrong people, right? So you want to really be clear about what those are, what those standards look like, what does it mean, so that you get the right people showing up and you keep the wrong people out of the, from coming in. That's one way I think they get motivated, is when they kind of really embrace that notion, so that they, one of the beauties of, I think, starting your own business is that you get to decide what kind of people you want to associate with to a certain degree. You certainly have to hire for some skills, but more importantly, you have to hire kind of for attitude and energy and all that kind of stuff. So we ask clients to really think about that, so that, when they start screening, when they start hiring more people, they know what kind of, we're all looking for the same kind of behavior traits.
So interesting. You made mention that as important it is to find the right people, it's also important to weed out the wrong people. And I think sometimes people focus on the top of the equation without that level of discernment. How do you help people make that distinction between the right fit and the wrong fit? Because I think
great question.
indecision
So we have a couple of
a
tools we
major
use
issue
when we're implementing
you
EOS with clients that help tease that out. One's called the accountability chart, which is really just trying to make sure that for each role, we know specifically what's the kind of skill set people need to be successful in that role. And then the other one we call the people analyzer, which helps to make sure that we got the right person from a culture fit standpoint. And when you combine those two, it teases out those scenarios where we have somebody that they might have the skill set, but they're not a good culture fit. And that's probably the toughest one, because you might have to give up some performance in the short term for the culture in the long term. And that's a tough pill for some clients to swallow, that they might have somebody that's really good in a particular job in terms of being able to do it, but frankly, the rest of the people in the organization don't like working with them, or don't trust them, or something about them behaviorally and the way they show up that can erode away the culture you're trying to create. So we ask clients, you don't want to let that fester. And that gets teased out when we take them through the people analyzer tool. And I just had this happen with a client literally within the last couple of weeks, where they have a gentleman in a particular role that he can do the job as it's specified, in terms of, does he have the ability to kind of fill that seat well? And the answer is yes. But when we asked for the team to look at, what about the values? And they had, I think, 5 or 6 now, if I remember right. 5 to 6. I think it might have been 5. And frankly, he did not measure up well at all on that. And so just going through that exercise helped all the people in the leadership team kind of confirm something they've been noticing. And that is, all right, he's a short-term fix, but he's not a long-term option. And so they now know that we can deal with this in the short term, but we need to find a different person for the long term.
Yeah, it's tough when someone gets it once, it has capacity, they have the skills, but if they don't fit in the actual culture.
Right.
Maybe it's the right seat for that person, but it's the wrong company, it's the wrong person for the company. Going back to your early age. So when you're growing up, when you were a kid, in school, what activities or interests, passions, hobbies were
So
you
the short answer to
involved
that is
in?
I grew
And
up
what did you think that you
in
wanted
a
to
family
do
of,
for a career before you started your
mostly
career, and why?
athletes, like my one brother who was kind of most athletic of his class. And, we played sports. And so, of course, I mean, I knew I wasn't good enough to play anything pro by any means, but, I measured myself based on, my athletic ability, basically, more so than my, academic. So, I thought I was going to be a phys ed teacher and just do that. And, and because I didn't know any better, really. But then when I got to college and started to realize there's other things that I can do that might be more beneficial and a better long-term option, I started to explore other things. But that's the short answer is I loved sports growing up. Yes, mostly, football. I played some basketball, baseball, even wrestled
That's interesting. Did you play
one or
mostly
two
team sport?
years. I liked them all. I was a pretty decent athlete. So, when I got tired of basketball, and then the wrestling coach kind of coerced me into saying, he saw I had some, basic talent. He said, we could use you. And I said, all right. Yes.
Wrestling coaches are notorious recruiters for other sports, specifically football.
Yes.
Like, hey, are you a lineman that wants to get
Yes.
better? You should be a heavyweight wrestler. And that's like the tried and true recruitment. It's interesting that you had an aspiration to be a phys ed teacher, because as a career consultant, coach, advisor, and again, with team sport background, you're kind of doing that same thing just as an adult, in a
Yes.
different
No, you're
progression
right. I
tier.
hadn't thought of it that way, but you're right.
Right?
And
Like you're
that
coaching teams on
it
how
is
to
very much a
win
coaching
in
thing
a
that I'm
sense.
doing these days, where, we're trying to help these clients implement this system and coach them along. We're not doing it for them. And so there is an element of coaching in terms of being given some very specific instruction at times, and then at other times being more encouragement. So lots of things a good coach needs to do.
Yeah. And I think there's all sorts of types of coaches that can be effective. One story I love to talk about in sports coaching analogy is the Oakland A's and the movie Moneyball with Billy Beane. If you're familiar with that story, Billy Beane would be on the faculty and the staff. I don't think he was telling people how to pitch better, wasn't telling people how to hit better, but he was doing what we mentioned earlier, the people analyzer work with an accountability chart, the roster, and say, hey, here's the scorecard. Here's how we're going to measure success. I think the number one KPI across the board, he was looking for on-base percentage, I believe it was. And people thought he was crazy. They thought he was nuts. They're like, that's not how we do this. We have this gut feeling, and we know talent because we know talent without tracking data. Right. So I would say the MLB was not on their health check getting 80% or above on their data.
You're right. No, that's a good, it's a good example of,
reset
when
how
we work
people
with our clients around
stats
getting their scorecard right for them, to kind of make sure that they're, not just kind of making decisions based on a whim or a feeling in the moment, but, that they're looking at the hard data.
So you've been doing either consulting or coaching for decades, right? Like you've been in the game. How has it changed and morphed over time for you? Like, how have you evolved as a coach consultant? And what are some? I mean, this is going to be a very loaded question, so take your time. And what are some of the things that you thought you knew for sure in the beginning that you now know?
So one of the things I think I figured out over time that, when you talk about inside organizations and they talk about engagement and our employees engaged, what I think a lot of folks fail to kind of see is that that's something that is an emotional engagement. That's, to me, how you measure that. Are they emotionally engaged? Not intellectually engaged, but emotionally engaged. And it goes back to this, what the data shows us these days is that if you can't get folks emotionally engaged, about the best you're going to get is compliance. if you get them emotionally engaged, you're going to get a committed effort, right? And so that is something I think a lot of folks in leadership positions forget sometimes. They think if I just, make it all clear and I lay out the steps, that's enough. And I'm like, no, you need to kind of figure out how do I turn them on? How do I get them connected to the bigger play and the longer view and reach them at an emotional level? And that's difficult. It's difficult for some leaders. So that's one of the things I think I've figured out. Along with that, though, is that you also need the data. You need the metrics, and that's part of it, because folks like to know, all right, what's my number? What do I need to focus on? That's not necessarily an emotional thing, but folks need to know, how am I doing? And so if I don't really know what my metric is, it's hard for me to know if I'm doing well or not. So there's an emotional piece and there's an irrational piece to it, but don't exclude the emotional piece. If you just give them the rational piece and say, here's your number, make it happen, that's probably not going to be enough for some folks.
People often forget what you say or what you do, but they won't forget how you make them feel. And I feel like that's an interesting dynamic to try and juggle, because yes, you have to empathize and connect with the person to person, but then you have to make it tangible and real. What I'm hearing from you is like the data helps to support that. So it's not just like, I had a mentor long ago that said, when you're asking someone to do something, pretend that you're physically taking the task, right? Like a piece of paper,
Yeah.
you're placing it with
Yeah.
both hands, making eye contact and putting it on into their hands. Don't just look over your shoulder and throw it over the fence, so to speak. And I think that is at the heart of what you're communicating on, like one of the
Yes.
lifelong skills.
Yes. And
coaching,
as much as I know that, and I can do that well with my
sure
clients, no surprise, I forget to do that when I'm dealing with my sons, where I'll just want to throw the task at them, and I'll forget to put myself in their shoes, and because I'll think, this is a piece of cake. Why are you hesitating? You should just go crush this. And I'm forgetting that, all right, maybe that's easy for me because I've done it hundreds of times, but maybe for them it's the first time and they're not as confident. And so can I see that rather than just throw it at them, so that I kind of put myself in their shoes? So I do it well with clients. I do it less well with my sons.
It's funny. I have a daughter. I don't have any sons. Well, who knows what the future will hold? And she's almost 3, so still young. She's getting better at, like, definitely you see a weekly progression of just like, oh my gosh, how'd you learn that word? Like, how are you doing full sentences, that kind of thing. And the number one thing I have to remind myself is, if she's not listening to me or like doing what I ask, one, she's probably emotionally frustrated or upset. There's something like bothering her. So I've been doing a breathing exercise, trying to calm her down. And I make sure she looks me in the eye when I talk. And that extra 15 seconds of intentionality when I'm trying to say something usually at least stops the tears. And then maybe she'll go ahead and listen. But if I don't look at her and I'm in the other room and say, hey, put your shoes away, it's a tantrum. And I wonder, obviously, that's just my experience, but it probably applies at each level. I just learn it repeatedly at young.
Yeah, no,
age. What are some of the lessons that you've learned from
it is
fatherhood
kind of
that
funny,
apply
because
to coaching that you probably just
when I'm
couldn't back when you
doing
did it?
some workshops with clients around, because sometimes I'm doing workshops on coaching skills, this comes up quite a bit, where I know that, all right, when I'm with a client, I can be much more conscious of it, much more intentional. And I know that while I'm doing that, I'm like, oh, I don't do this as much with my boys. So I'm the classic example of the cobbler who builds shoes for everybody else, but forgets to put good shoes on his own kids. So it's a, I like to say that at least I got awareness around it. So that's half the battle. So, but I got to get better at remembering when I'm dealing with them, that I can put myself in their shoes, just like I do with my clients.
Yeah, that's so interesting. The cobbler analogy. I've heard that time and time again. And I think what you mentioned really hits home. The first step in IDS, which is identify, discuss, and solve, and how you handle issue processing, is to identify. And you mentioned this in the beginning of our conversation, that if you don't identify the problem, it just festers and gets worse over time. So what are some of the ways that you help to pause leaders and dig deep and get them? They might think something is an issue, but you've been consulting for long enough. Like, maybe
Yeah,
this
so
isn't it a symptom
that
as
starts
opposed to a
with
cause? Like, how do
this
you help to
notion you may
dig
have heard
deeper and get to
before
the root
about
cause of some
my
problems?
first task is to kind of create some safety in the room, right? And that's done by just how I show up, and B, how I try to be non-judgmental no matter what I'm hearing. And I go in with the assumption that, everybody that's going to show up today probably came in with every intention of wanting to do what's right for the business. I'm going to make that assumption, and I'm going to believe that of them coming in. And what comes out a lot in these conversations is their own frustrations with processes or lack of processes, or just, their challenges with trying to move the business forward. And that comes out in their expressions and their frustrations and what they say we need to fix. And so the first thing I have to remember to do is just acknowledge that. And then, as you said, kind of pause and then ask good open-ended questions to make sure that we are getting at the root issue. Like, is this really the issue? Or tell me more about that. Or, recapping what I'm hearing, and then maybe even saying, that sounds like a solution to me, but you tell me. So there's just varying things you do to kind of keep the conversation going and make sure that they really are getting to the root issue, asking those why questions, etc. But always asking them from a spirit of curiosity versus judgment, right? So, they'll sense that from your tone. I think that, I'm curious, or I'm just wondering why, and is this
Curiosity versus
really
judgment.
the issue here, or is it something else? And then usually folks will say, no, you're right, that's not really the issue, and we get a little closer. And so and also we call, in the EOS world, we have a phrase called enter the danger, and that just refers to not being afraid to talk about things that maybe the people in the leadership team in the room are afraid to bring up, but they appreciate if we would bring it up, because it may be the elephant in the room that they don't want to touch, because it's going to, rub somebody the wrong way, or bring up something that they know somebody's going to have an emotional response to. And that's part of what I think we're paid to do, is to enter that danger and bring it up and say, well, I noticed when I said this that everybody got quiet. Help me with that. Why is that? And then, usually somebody will kind of say, well, you're hitting on something. And then we're starting to get at the real issue, which is really what we need to do ultimately.
The way you phrase that, it seems like a common human fear or aversion. They say that fear of death and fear of public speaking are typically, up there with number one and number two. But especially for developmental years, fear of the dark. And sounds like your job is just to shine light on what people are kind of afraid of, and like gently, patiently help them
I think
confront
so.
their fears.
And
Never thought
for
of
me, and then I think for other
implementing
folks
that
who've been
lens
doing this
before,
a
but
while,
you
one
made
of
me
the
think about it.
challenges becomes, we might see, because I have this going on with a client right now, we might see the real issue fairly quickly because we're on the outside looking in, but the client may not see it as quickly, or the client may not get there as fast as we do. And so then you have this challenge of, how do I kind of help them see this without just throwing in their face in such a way that they don't want to look at it. So you have to kind of coax them along. And so it's a real challenge around, it's just the whole notion of meeting the client where they are, rather than, I can see where they need to be and I want to get them there fast. And I haven't necessarily figured out the exact way to kind of reconcile that, but that's the kind of the challenge, is how do I kind of get them to what I'm seeing that seems clear without forcing it.
I want to ask you a question to put you on the other side of the equation. What events occurred for you to become familiar with EOS and make
the
the
short
transition
answer
to
is
becoming
my first kind of
I want to
corporate
hear like that
experiences
part of your
were all
career journey.
around what you might call learning and development types of roles, where I was I was asked to kind of create learning experiences and facilitate them for different clients or different internal groups. And ultimately, it went from technical stuff to stuff called around TQM or total quality management to leadership related stuff, which I would call soft skills. And a lot of that would often be stuff that was where your facilitation skills needed to be strong, meaning you're trying to get people to recognize patterns that they may be stuck in that they're not aware of, and make them aware of them, and try to figure out, how do we get beyond this? How do we work through some conflict situations, which are always highly emotional? So, and then I was doing a lot of what I would call strategic planning kinds of conversations with clients, which has one part is the intellectual kind of rigor of kind of doing our SWOT or doing whatever whatever the thought process we need to get through to kind of figure out our goals for the year, et cetera. But then there's also the reading between the lines and understanding the tensions and the personalities at play, and how do we navigate through that, right? Which is more around what I would call the emotional kind of intelligence work. So I've been doing that a while, and I've been working with clients around what I would call a lot of the vision stuff, people stuff, a little less of the data. And what happened for me is when I came across EOS, I was like, ooh, this kind of completes the work that I had been missing in my consulting work, because I didn't really address the data stuff. I kind of helped them with some working through issues, process a little bit. But when I saw the EOS model, I was like, ooh, this is a really nice, simple way of pulling it all together. And so that's what just clicked for me. It reminded me of, because I had, in an earlier time, I had been asked to get certified in Covey 7 Habits and offer that as a workshop. And to me, they're very similar in that the models are fairly straightforward. They're not hard to understand. Like in the Covey thing, it's 7 habits. It's not 37 habits. And so you can get your arms around it. It makes sense. It's kind of common sense when you see it, and I walk people through it. But the discipline of doing it every day, that's a whole different story. And to me, EOS is very similar. That's not hard to understand, this model. It's not hard to understand what you need to do. It's just a discipline of doing it and staying focused. So that all made sense to me, to connect it. And then when I saw the EOS model and somebody walked me through it, I was like, ooh, I need this. I need to bring this into my work. So a buddy of mine who's been doing leadership development work, which is where him and I crossed paths,
implementation,
probably 15 years ago. He got in about 6 years ago and mentioned it to me at the time, but I was too busy. And then about 2.5 years ago, I sat down with him again. I said, tell me about this EOS thing again. Give me a little bit more of a deep dive. And when he did, I said, I need to get in it. So I've been doing it about coming up on 2 years in September. And, if anything, I wish I'd stumbled across it sooner.
Mm-hmm. That's funny. And
yes,
I think most people that are in the EOS journey would say the same thing. It's like, oh, I wish I would have known this back then. So on that same line of thinking, Rich, if you could have a conversation with yourself at 8 and you wanted to be a phys ed teacher and you're all into sports versus where you're at today, how would that conversation go? What would you tell us?
Well, I think in hindsight, because like neither of my folks went to college, so they didn't really could advise me, in terms of what to do or what direction. I think I would have probably just gone for a general business degree, because I think I would have liked to have just gotten that grounding in, what is it to be in a business, running a business, et cetera. And that would have given me a nice grounding that might have accelerated my direction and not gotten me to maybe like an EOS thing sooner. So I just ended up being a very kind of, zigzagging way that I got there. And I don't regret necessarily, but I probably would have just started out with some kind of general business degree rather than the phys ed degree.
Gotcha. Okay. That makes sense. What in your experience has been the most common or pervasive, or for lack of a better term, the one challenge that if you could figure out and solve for yourself,
I got an answer for me, and then
what would that one challenge
when you were
be?
first phrasing it, I thought you were talking about with clients. So I have a different answer for clients, but for me, My challenge is the shiny object dilemma, because I like a lot of different things. I like, and so I'm guilty of, oh, that looks pretty cool over there. Let me go look at that. So I can get distracted easily, which is something I'm still working on. For clients, I don't think this is going to surprise you. I think for a lot of my clients, the hardest thing is for them to hold people accountable to what they need to get done and wade into those conversations and just have them, because I think they just, they don't want to upset people or whatever the case might be. I got a family run business right now where they're nice people. It's both their strength and their weakness. They're really nice, but they're so nice that they won't necessarily have hard conversations with people around something they're not getting that they need to get from them.
That they're two totally separate things, but they're kind of related, right? Because it's, it's treating everything equally, right? So the shiny object syndrome, I find, is that what you said with EOS, it's not necessarily that it's super complicated, but the difficult part is in the consistency and the discipline to say, all right, don't get off track. And with the family-owned business example, with having the hard conversation and the danger, it's like there's no conditional entering the danger. It's like, doesn't matter if it's your father, brother, daughter, or some person you just hired a month ago. You have to treat be consistent and disciplined in how you interact and communicate. And that's the hard part, right? Is like, it's not knowing what you should do. It's doing, is like harnessing it within you. It's like doing that which feels either uncomfortable or boring or scary.
No, that's why I made that connection back to the Covey model.
I'm like doing it anyway.
The Covey concepts, they're all self-evident principles, but it's just doing it consistently is hard. Because, there's so I like to say some days I do pretty well with sticking to the Covey principles. Some days I do less well.
It reminds me of, I'm going to go back to sports, something that we can relate with. If you've ever heard of the physical trainer, Tim Grover, does that name ring a bell? So he wrote a book called Relentless, and he was the strength and conditioning trainer for Michael Jordan, Kobe Bryant, Dwayne Wade. So some of the most Hall of Famers, right, in the NBA. And it's not that Michael Jordan or any of those people had anything that was lacking, right? But he was one of those guys that was just like, hey, I'm going to demand the best out of you. I know that you want this. And he's like, this is the program that's going to get you physically, get your energy to the place that you can go through the season, not get tired, not get injured. Strength training wasn't really a fad in the 90s, at least what it is today. And he kind of helped popularize that. And it's arguable to say, like, Michael Jordan's, I would say, the greatest basketball player of all time. But if he didn't have a coach that helped to optimize his human energy, would he be that? Who knows? That's a question mark. Some of the best business owners of all time may have this great inherent talent, may have the greatest idea, may have great skills. But if they don't have somebody to hold them accountable and make sure that they're getting the best that they can be, it's like, it's just I feel like it's just wasted energy, wasted human potential. So my next question, I'm teeing up my next question for you, Rich. It's all part of my grand plan. If you were given $10 million today, what are the top 3 things?
In no particular order. The first one that pops to mind is I'd pay off my one son's remaining college loans. Take care of just some financial stuff that's been lingering around. The thing that's probably more noble, I guess, for lack of a better word, is as I think about some of the challenges going on in the country, I've been talking with some neighbors and others that of this whole notion of a push to get back to some kind of national service, so that something that brings people together, some kind of program that when you graduate high school, you spend, you give a couple of years of yourself over to some national service projects where we put them in a cohorts of 150 people from across the country and give them something to do that requires them to work together. And to me, that would bring together and get us out of this red state, blue state divide better than anything. So that would be something I think would be worth sinking my teeth and money into.
This is going to be fun. The second part of this is, if you had the same scenario, you're just $10 million out of the clear blue sky, but with that, you were notified that you have 6 months.
That's a great question.
How
I
What would you
mean,
do then? Would that
short answer
change?
is probably. I mean, there's some things that I'd like to do and places I'd like to go and see. You know, I just had a call earlier today where I was talking to another gentleman, another EOS implementer, who we both had this kind of bucket list idea of taking an RV and going and seeing parts of the country we haven't seen yet, and just kind of going wherever we feel like going. So there's a part of me that would like to do that. There's a part of me that would like to see other parts of other countries. I still wouldn't mind also trying that initiative and getting it started at least, and finding some folks that can carry it forward, even if I only had 6 months. So I probably would try to figure out how I could do all of that still and have to squeeze it in somehow. Yeah. Yes.
And just have more fun experiences with people you care about at the same time. That's cool.
If you were to get a tattoo and you only had one on your entire body that said something about something that's really, really important to you, what would that tattoo be or say? No, I do not. I don't, but somebody had posed it as I saw it. I don't know if it was I don't know if it was on a video I saw or I read, but somebody said this was a good way to ask somebody to help them get clear about what they're passionate about. And I was in there and I was like, oh, that is a good way to kind of a fun way, especially with so many people getting younger crowds getting tattoos these days. That seems to be a rite of passage. That is it. Yeah, no, you wonder if it's, when it's going to become like, everybody gets tattoos. I'm going to not get a tattoo.
I think so.
As being
I myself have like 10.
Seems to go in cycles.
Well, that's definitely leaving us with something to think about. Rich, I appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation, talking about your EOS journey. And everyone else, I appreciate you listening as always. I don't run ads on the show.
Ross,
I don't plan to.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
The only ask I have is to share it with a friend if you found it to be beneficial. Rich, thank you for your time.